Some nights the sky holds a kind of stillness that feels almost deliberate, as if the dark has slowed everything down just for you. One light above, one soft source of warmth rising and setting in the same patient rhythm it has followed for longer than memory can hold. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you're welcome to stay. Now, let's drift. There is a question that drifts in quietly the way certain thoughts arrive only in the hush before sleep. What if that single light above were not alone? What if somewhere out past the edge of what we know, a world turned beneath two suns instead of one? It sounds like something borrowed from a story, but scientists suggest it is something closer to ordinary than we tend to imagine. Out among the stars, two suns sharing a sky is not the exception. In many corners of the galaxy, it may even be closer to the rule. Picture for a moment not Earth as it is, but a quiet variation of it. A version of home turning slowly under a different kind of light. Two suns bound to each other by gravity holding a steady orbit around a shared center, the way two hands might rest together without either one pulling away. Researchers have found that binary star systems, two stars orbiting a common point, make up a very large share of the stars we can see. Some estimates suggest that more than half of the stars in our galaxy belong to a pair, or sometimes even more. Our own sun alone in its quiet sky might actually be the less common arrangement. There is something gentle in that thought. The idea that solitude, the kind our sun has always known, might be the rarer story among the stars, and that somewhere else light has always come in twos. It seems that the universe rarely repeats itself in exactly the same way twice. Even among binary systems, no two pairs behave quite alike. Some stars orbit closely locked in a tight, intimate dance, completing a full circle around each other in only a matter of days. Others drift much farther apart, taking centuries to complete what feels on a cosmic scale like a single slow breath. The mind quietly registers this kind of variation as something almost musical. Two stars, two different colors, perhaps one shading toward gold, one leaning into something dimmer and redder, turning around each other in a rhythm too slow for any single lifetime to witness all the way through. A world placed correctly around such a pair would not simply orbit one star, it would orbit the system itself, the shared center the two stars create together. Scientists are still exploring exactly how a planet finds a stable place in such an arrangement. Because gravity, when it comes from two directions instead of one, behaves with a little more nuance, a little more negotiation. And maybe that is part of what makes this thought so soothing to sit with tonight. Not the strangeness of two suns, but the quiet stability that somehow still finds a way to exist inside something so layered. Even gravity pulled in two directions at once can still settle into something steady, something that holds. Imagine standing on such a world, if only in the soft, unfocused way the mind imagines things, just before sleep. The horizon would not behave the way it does here. There might be two shapes of light low in the sky at once, one paler one with a faint tint of colour, casting two soft shadows from a single tree, two gentle outlines instead of one. Psychologists often note that human beings are deeply shaped by light, more than we usually notice in the middle of an ordinary day. The rhythm of brightness and dimness around us quietly shapes mood focus, even the depth of our breathing. A world with two suns might offer a kind of light that never fully matches anything we already carry inside us, not brighter necessarily, just layered differently, a blend instead of a single tone. It may be that depending on the distance and size of each star, the second sun in such a sky would not always dominate. Sometimes it might sit low and quiet near the horizon, almost like a second moon with a touch more warmth in it. Other times, if the two stars happen to be closer in size, the sky itself might hold two near equal sources of gold. There is something in that image worth sitting with for a moment. Two sources of light present at once, neither one needing to dim the other in order to be seen. The brain tends to interpret light, even imagined light, as a kind of reassurance. It is one of the oldest associations we carry, older than language, older than memory itself. Light, meaning warmth, meaning safety, meaning the world continuing to exist around us, even as our eyes begin to close. A second sun, however unfamiliar, might still register somewhere quiet in the mind as simply more of that same reassurance. Not stranger, just doubled. Of course, not every binary system would feel gentle in this way. Some pairs of stars sit close enough together that a planet caught between them would face conditions far less hospitable, intense and shifting in ways that would be difficult for anything delicate to survive. But studies indicate that certain configurations, particularly when a planet orbits the pair from a wider, more distant position, can actually offer a kind of stability. A quiet middle ground where two suns provide warmth without overwhelming what grows beneath them. It seems the universe, even in its most unfamiliar arrangements, still tends to leave room for balance somewhere within the complexity. Not always, but often enough to notice. There is a particular kind of comfort in that idea, the thought that even amid two suns, two gravities, two intertwined rhythms of light, something steady can still emerge. A version of calm that simply looks different from the one we already know. Neuroscientists have observed that the human mind, especially in these quiet, low-alert hours, tends to drift toward images rather than facts. Not the technical structure of an orbit, but the feeling of standing beneath a sky, holding two soft lights instead of one. The texture of warmth on skin that might come from two directions instead of one, not bigger, just gentler in a way that feels layered. So for now, you don't need to hold every detail of this, just the simple shape of it. Somewhere out past what we can usually see, there may be a quiet world turning beneath two patient suns, neither one in a hurry, both content to share the same slow sky. And the way that double light might fall across a field like that, soft and overlapping, is something worth letting your mind sit with a little longer. There is more waiting quietly in that same direction. More to notice about the way two lights can shape a single gentle world. For now, let it stay soft, let it stay distant. Let it simply be there, turning slowly somewhere far past the edge of this dark and quiet room. Some rooms feel quieter the longer you lie still in them. The kind of quiet where even your own breathing starts to sound far away. If you are still here, still settled into that same soft dark, you can stay exactly as you are. Let's keep drifting. Before the thought of two suns sharing one sky drifted in, gently, almost like a held breath. Tonight that same thought widens just a little. Not the picture of it anymore, but the quiet architecture underneath. The way two suns actually come to share a sky in the first place. Researchers have found that most stars are not born alone. They tend to form inside enormous clouds of gas and dust, vast and slow-moving, where gravity pulls matter together in clusters rather than single points. Within those clouds, it is common for two clumps of matter to collapse close enough to each other that neither one fully escapes the other's pull. Instead of becoming two separate distant stars, they become bound, linked, caught in a long, patient orbit around a shared centre of mass. There is something tender in that idea if you let it sit for a moment. Two stars born from the same quiet cloud, never quite letting go of each other afterward. What we understand so far suggests there are a few different ways this bond can take shape. Sometimes the two stars orbit closely, almost touching in cosmic terms, completing their loop around each other in a matter of days. Astronomers often call this kind of arrangement a close binary. Other times the distance between them stretches much farther, the orbit unfolding so slowly that it might take hundreds, even thousands of years to complete a single full turn. A wide binary calm and unhurried, like two old companions content to simply remain in the same general direction without needing to stay close. It seems both kinds carry their own kind of stillness. The close pair lock tightly finishes its dance quickly over and over, almost rhythmically. The wide pair barely seems to move at all from the outside, a single slow gesture stretched across centuries. And somewhere between those two extremes is where a planet, if one exists at all, has to find its place. Scientists are still exploring how exactly a world manages to stay steady inside a system shaped by two different sources of gravity instead of one. There are broadly two ways it can happen. A planet might orbit only one of the two stars, staying close enough to it that the second star, while visible, simply pulls gently from a distance, more like a quiet influence than a true second center. This is sometimes called an S-type orbit. Or a planet can do something a little more unusual. It can step back far enough to orbit both stars together, treating the pair almost like a single combined source of gravity. This is known as a P-type or circumbinary orbit, the same kind of slow wide loop we touched on before. The mind quietly registers these two possibilities almost like two different temperaments. One planet staying close to a single familiar source with a second light simply present nearby. Another planet choosing distance, holding both lights equally, never favoring one over the other. There is no real right or wrong in gravity, only what becomes stable and what does not. It may be that this is one of the more delicate parts of having two suns instead of one. Gravity rarely settles into something simple right away. In the earliest stages of a star system's life, before any orbit becomes steady, there can be a long period of gentle adjustment. Smaller bodies planets included drift shift, sometimes spiral inward, sometimes get nudged outward until a balance is finally found, or in some cases never quite is. Evidence suggests that many worlds forming around binary stars may not survive that early adjustment at all. Some are pulled too close to one star and lost. Others are flung outward into the cold and dark beyond any star's reach. But the worlds that do survive, the ones that find a stable orbit and hold it, tend to hold it for a very, very long time. Once gravity settles, it rarely changes its mind. There is something almost reassuring in that. The idea that stability once truly found becomes something lasting. Not fragile, not temporary, simply quiet and permanent the way some kinds of peace are. Psychologists often note that human beings respond to predictability in much the same way on a much smaller scale. A steady rhythm once established in breathing and sleep in the quiet patterns of an evening tends to feel safer the longer it repeats. Maybe that is part of why this image settles so easily into the mind. A world finding its balance between two suns is in its own distant way doing the same thing your body is doing right now, searching for the shape of stillness and then settling into it. The brain tends to interpret balance wherever it appears as something worth resting into. Even imagined balance, even balance happening somewhere we will never see around stars we will never visit. Of course, gravity is rarely silent about its work. Even in a stable system, the pull between two stars creates subtle ongoing effects. Tides, much like the ones that move oceans here, but shaped by two sources instead of one. Slight shifts in a planet's orbit over very long stretches of time. Occasionally faint gravitational waves, ripples in space itself, far too small for anything but the most sensitive instruments to ever notice. Neuroscientists have observed that the human mind, this late into stillness, tends to favor large, slow movements over small, sharp details. Not the precise mathematics of an orbit, just the feeling of something enormous moving slowly somewhere far away, while everything immediately around you stays soft and unmoving. So you do not need to hold every part of this either, just the underlying shape. Two stars born together, bound by gravity, slowly working out their own quiet rhythm. A planet somewhere within that rhythm, finding its own way to stay steady. Stability once it arrives, choosing to stay. There is still something gentle left to notice about a world like that. Not the gravity holding it in place, but the way light itself would fall across its surface, never quite leaving, never quite settling into full darkness, the way a single sun allows. That part can wait just a little longer. For now, let the stars stay where they are. Let the orbit stay slow. Let your own breathing stay just as steady, just as unhurried drifting along beside it. You said ban la chun za viet kik ban tiếng Anh kể chuyện khoa học trước khi ngủ trên kênh YouTube. Bạn có màu sắc kể chuyện độc đáo hấp dẫn riêng biệt mang đậm đi. There is a particular stillness that settles in around this point in the night. Not sleep yet, but close to it. The kind of quiet where thoughts move a little slower, a little softer than before. If that is where you are right now, you are exactly where you need to be. Let's keep drifting. Before the conversation rested on gravity, on the slow architecture holding two stars together. Tonight it shifts gently towards something softer still. Light. Not the gravity that shapes a world like that, but the glow that would fall across it. Researchers have found that on a planet orbiting two stars together, in that wide shared kind of orbit, darkness rarely behaves the way it does here. On Earth, night is fairly absolute. One sun sets and the sky empties itself of warmth, leaving only the colder light of stars and moon. But on a world with two suns, there may often be a second source of light still present even after the first has slipped below the horizon. It seems that true complete darkness, the kind we take for granted every single night, might become something rarer there. Something that only happens during certain alignments when both stars happen to set or rise close together. The rest of the time there could be a kind of perpetual dusk, a soft lingering glow that never quite resolves into full black. There is something almost comforting in that picture, even if it sounds unusual at first. A night that is never entirely empty of light. A darkness that keeps a small quiet companion with it. What we understand so far suggests that the exact colour of that light would depend heavily on the type of stars involved. Stars are not all the same. Some burn hotter and bluer, others cooler and redder. And the colour we see from Earth, that familiar warm yellow-white, comes from our sun's particular temperature and composition. A binary system might pair two very different kinds of stars together. One could resemble our own sun, closely casting a familiar golden warmth. The other might lean toward deep orange, or even a dim, smouldering red, the colour of a star slowly cooling with age. Imagine the kind of evening light that pairing might create. Not one sunset, but two colours blending together across the same sky. A gold tone settling low near the horizon, while a faint rose or amber tint lingers somewhere else entirely, neither one fully replacing the other. The brain tends to interpret blended light like that, layered tones, rather than a single uniform glow, as something unusually soft. Almost the way candlelight feels different from a bright overhead lamp, not because it is dimmer, but because it carries more than one shade within it at once. Evidence suggests that colour itself plays a quiet role in how the body prepares for rest. Warmer tones, reds and ambers in particular, tend to signal evening to the human nervous system, encouraging the kind of gradual slowing down that leads towards sleep. Cooler, bluer light does the opposite, keeping the mind a little more alert, a little more awake. A sky with two suns blending warm and cool together might create something the body has never quite had to interpret before. Not one clear signal, a gentler, layered one instead. It may be that such a world would never fully separate day from night the way we do. Instead, there might be long, slow gradients between the two. A kind of extended twilight that lasts for hours rather than minutes, the sky shifting through soft variations of colour, before finally settling briefly into something closer to true dark. Psychologists often note that twilight itself, even here on Earth, holds a particular emotional quality that people tend to associate with reflection. The hour when colours shift and the edges of things soften. A world where that kind of light lingered longer, where dusk was not a brief transition, but a slow extended stretch of time, might simply offer more of that same quiet, reflective feeling, not stranger, just more present. There would likely be other small differences too, ones easy to overlook at first. Shadows, for instance. On Earth, a single sun creates a single clean shadow behind anything it touches. With two suns in the sky at once, especially during the hours when both are visible together, objects might cast two faint shadows instead of one overlapping slightly, their edges blurred where the two lights meet. The mind quietly registers small visual details like that as oddly familiar even when describing something we have never personally seen. Perhaps because doubled or layered light already exists here in smaller ways. The soft double shadow beneath a street lamp and the moon, the way candlelight and a window's glow can blend in a quiet room. A world with two suns might simply offer a much larger version of something we already quietly know the feeling of. Colour would shift in other ways as well. Scientists are still exploring how plant life, if it existed on such a world, might adapt to two different wavelengths of light instead of one. Here on Earth, the green of leaves comes from chlorophyll tuned specifically to absorb the kind of light our single sun provides. A world bathed in light from two different stars might favour a different palette entirely. Some researchers have speculated about deep reds or even near black foliage suited to capture energy from dimmer or differently coloured stars far more efficiently than green ever could. There is something quietly strange and beautiful in that thought. Not green fields beneath that sky, but something darker, deeper in tone, holding warmth in a different way than the colours we already know. It seems the longer this image sits in the mind, the less foreign it becomes. Two suns, two shades of light. A long, soft twilight that never fully resolves into black. None of it feels dramatic when you slow down enough to sit with it. It simply feels like another way light has learned to exist somewhere far from here. And there is a quieter layer to this one that most people never think to ask about. What happens not just to the light falling on such a world, but to the air itself, the way it moves, the way warmth settles unevenly across a place that never fully rests in shadow. That part can stay just out of focus for now. Let the twilight linger a little longer. Let the colours stay soft and unresolved the way they tend to in that last stretch of evening, right before everything settles into quiet. You said ban là chuyên gia, việc kịch bản tiếng Anh, kể chuyện khoa học trước khi ngủ trên kênh YouTube. Bạn có màu sắc kể chuyện độc đáo hấp dẫn riêng biệt mang đậm đà. Some thoughts arrive slowly the way warmth spreads through a blanket after you've been still beneath it for a while. Not sudden, just gradually filling in. If you're somewhere close to that feeling right now, you can simply stay there. Let's keep drifting. Before the light was the focus, the long twilight, the layered colours a sky with two suns might hold. Now the air itself drifts into view. Not what falls onto such a world, but how it might move once it gets there. Researchers have found that climate, even here on Earth, is largely a story about uneven heating. The equator receives more direct sunlight than the poles, and that imbalance is what drives almost everything we think of as weather. Wind, ocean currents, the slow churn of warm air rising and cool air sinking somewhere else to take its place. Heat does not like to sit still. It moves until it finds something closer to balance. It seems that a planet warmed by two suns instead of one would carry an entirely different version of that same restlessness. Depending on the size, distance, and brightness of each star, certain regions might receive a gentle, steady warmth from both sources at once, while other regions, perhaps the ones facing away during a particular stretch of the orbit, might fall into a much deeper, longer cold than anything we experience here. There is something quietly humbling in that thought. The same kind of imbalance that gives us gentle, familiar seasons might, with two suns instead of one, become something far more dramatic. Not cruel necessarily, just unevenly shared. What we understand so far suggests that the orbital relationship between a planet and its two suns plays a major role in how stable or unstable that warmth ends up being. In a wide circumbinary orbit, the kind where a planet circles both stars together, from a comfortable distance the warmth tends to average out more evenly over time, even if the two stars individually rise and set in slightly different rhythms. But in systems where the two stars themselves are locked in a tighter, faster orbit around each other, the total amount of light and heat reaching the planet can shift more noticeably as the stars' positions change relative to one another. The mind quietly registers this as something like breathing that isn't quite steady, not erratic, just slightly uneven, a longer inhale here, a shorter one there, the kind of rhythm that still settles you even if it never repeats in exactly the same way twice. Evidence suggests that on certain binary planets, particularly those orbiting closely spaced stars, temperature swings could happen on timescales far shorter than the seasons we know. Instead of 4 gradual shifts across a single year, such a world might experience smaller, more frequent fluctuations, tied less to a single orbit around one star and more to the complex layered dance between two gravitational centers. It may be that the word season itself would mean something different there, less like 4 distinct chapters repeating in order, and more like a long continuous variation. Warmer stretch and cooler stretches blending into each other without ever quite settling into a fixed, memorized pattern. A rhythm that resembles ours but never quite repeats itself the same way our 4 seasons do year after year. Psychologists often note that humans tend to find comfort in predictable cycles, the reliable return of certain weather, certain light, certain feelings tied to particular times of year. A world where that predictability softened slightly, where the rhythm was real but slightly looser, might ask something different of whatever life existed there. Not a stricter memory, perhaps a gentler one. Less about expecting exactly what comes next and more about simply moving with whatever arrives. There is a kind of ease in that if you let yourself sit with it. Less certainty, but also less rigidity. A world that adapts continuously rather than waiting for 4 fixed cues to tell it when to change. Scientists are still exploring how atmospheres themselves might respond to this kind of double warmth, particularly the way winds and air pressure systems would behave under 2 heat sources instead of 1. On Earth, our jet streams and large-scale wind patterns form largely because of the temperature difference between the equator and the poles. A planet with 2 suns, especially one where the heating became uneven in more complex ways, might develop more intricate patterns of wind. Multiple jet streams, perhaps layered and overlapping the way the light itself might overlap in the sky above. The brain tends to find a strange comfort in complexity, as long as it still resolves into something steady underneath. The same way a piece of music can hold several melodies at once and still feel calm rather than chaotic, as long as those melodies move together rather than against each other. A more complicated wind pattern does not necessarily mean a harsher world. It might simply mean a more layered one, more textured, like a quilt stitched from more than one fabric but still warm in the same simple way any blanket is warm. Neuroscientists have observed that complexity, when it remains gentle and slow enough, can actually deepen a feeling of restfulness rather than disturb it. The mind does not need simplicity to feel safe. It needs rhythm, a pattern, however intricate, that it can settle into without needing to predict every single detail in advance. So perhaps that is the quiet truth sitting underneath all of this. A world shaped by 2 suns would not necessarily be harsher or more chaotic than ours, just more layered, its winds a little more complex, its warmth a little more unevenly shared, its seasons less like 4 fixed doors and more like a long continuous unfolding. There is something underneath all of that movement though, something steadier than wind or warmth that has not been mentioned yet. The quiet pull that holds the air, the oceans, and everything else in place to begin with, no matter how the light above keeps shifting. For now, let that stay just out of reach. Let the wind in that imagined sky keep moving softly somewhere far away, while everything close to you stays exactly as still as it already is. There is a kind of weight that settles into the body around this point in the night. Not heaviness exactly, just a quiet sense of sinking a little deeper into wherever you already are. Let's keep drifting. Before the wind moved across an imagined world shaped by two suns uneven and layered in its warmth. Now the attention settles on something steadier underneath all of that movement. Gravity itself and the strange quiet tug of two suns pulling at the same world from two different directions at once. Studies indicate that gravity never really stops working, even in places that look completely still. Here on Earth, the moon's gravity pulls gently at our oceans, and that pull is what creates the tides, the slow rise and fall of water along every coastline twice a day, almost like the planet itself is breathing. It is a small reminder that even something we cannot see is still quietly shaping the world around us. On a planet with two suns instead of one, that same pulling would not come from a single source. It would come from their two layered on top of each other, sometimes working together, sometimes working against each other, depending on where each star happens to sit in its slow orbit. It seems that when two gravitational pulls align, when both suns happen to sit in roughly the same direction relative to the planet, their combined pull could create tides noticeably stronger than anything we experience here. Not violent necessarily, just deeper. A more pronounced rise and fall water reaching further inland before slowly retreating again. There is something almost rhythmic in that thought. The ocean breathing a little more deeply than ours does, simply because it has two sources pulling at it instead of one. What we understand so far suggests that when the two suns sit on opposite sides of the planet, instead their pulls would partially cancel each other out, creating gentler tides for a time. A softer rise and fall, almost like a held breath. And depending on how the stars continue to move through their own long orbit around each other, a single planet might shift slowly between these two states. Stronger tides and gentler tides over the course of months, or sometimes years. The mind quietly registers this as a kind of layered rhythm, very much like breathing that changes pace depending on the moment, sometimes deep and slow, sometimes lighter and quick, but never fully losing its underlying pattern. Researchers have found that tides are not only about water either. The same gravitational pulling that moves oceans can also very subtly shift solid ground, an effect known as land tides, far too small for us to feel directly but measurable with sensitive instruments even here on Earth. A planet experiencing two layered sources of gravity might have a slightly more pronounced version of this same effect, an extremely gentle flexing of its crust, slow and almost imperceptible sinking quietly with the position of its two suns. It may be that over very long stretches of time, this kind of repeated gravitational flexing could even influence certain geological processes. Volcanic activity, for instance, can sometimes be affected by tidal forces elsewhere in the solar system. Some of Jupiter's moons, particularly Io, experience intense volcanic activity, largely because of the powerful tidal pull from Jupiter itself stretching and compressing the moon's interior with every orbit. A planet caught between two stars might carry a gentler version of that same internal restlessness, not destructive, just quietly active beneath the surface the way a body sometimes carries a low, steady warmth deep inside even while the skin stays cool. Evidence suggests that the relationship between two stars also shapes something a little more delicate, the long-term stability of a planet's orbit itself. Over millions of years, the gravitational influence of two suns can cause very slow shifts in how a planet tilts, or how perfectly circular its orbit remains. Scientists are still exploring how these slow changes might affect climate over extremely long timescales, changes that would unfold far too gradually for any single lifetime to notice, but that could shape the deep geological rhythms of such a world over time. There is something quietly soothing in the scale of that. Changes so slow they would never feel sudden. Shifts so gradual they would blend seamlessly into whatever rhythm life there had already grown used to. Psychologists often note that humans tend to find comfort in things that move slowly enough to feel safe, even when those things are technically always changing. The tide itself is a good example. It never stays still, and yet very few people watching the ocean from a quiet shore feel unsettled by that motion. The slowness is what makes it soothing. The predictability inside the motion, even though the water itself is never exactly the same from one moment to the next. A planet shaped by two layered tides, two overlapping gravities, might carry that same quality just on a larger, slower scale. Not chaotic, simply more textured. A world where even stillness contains motion, the way the surface of a deep lake can look calm while currents move quietly far beneath it. Neuroscientists have observed that this particular kind of imagery, slow movement beneath visible stillness, tends to ease the nervous system rather than activate it. Perhaps because it mirrors with something the body already trusts. The slow rhythm of breath continuing steadily, even during the deepest, quietest parts of sleep when almost nothing else seems to be moving at all. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, underneath everything we have walked through so far. Not just gravity holding a planet in place, but something quieter still, something tied less to stars and orbits and more to memory and rhythm, and the way the body recognizes safety long before the mind finds the words for it. For now, let the tide settle. Let the ground stay still, even if something slow and patient continues to move just beneath its surface. There will be time to follow that quieter thread a little further, but not yet, not tonight. Just let it rest there soft and unhurried, the way everything else has been resting too. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in around now. The kind where time itself seems to lose its usual edges. You may not know exactly how long you have been lying here, and that not knowing is its own small kind of rest. Let's keep drifting. Before the focus rested on gravity, the tides, the slow pull of two suns, shaping a world from somewhere deep beneath its surface. Now the attention shifts towards something a little more delicate. Time itself and what it might mean to lose the simple, familiar shape of a year. Here on Earth, our sense of time is built almost entirely around one steady relationship. One planet tilted slightly circling one star, in a path that repeats itself every 365 days, give or take. That single dependable loop gives us our seasons, our calendars, the quiet internal sense that a year has a beginning and an end, even if we rarely think about it directly. Scientists are still exploring what that same sense of time might feel like on a planet circling two suns instead of one, especially in the wider shared orbits where a world circles both stars together. In some configurations, the planet's path is fairly steady, and the two stars' positions relative to each other shift only slowly, meaning seasons might still exist, just shaped slightly differently than the ones we know. But in other configurations, particularly where the two stars themselves orbit each other relatively quickly compared to the planet's own path around them, both the warmth reaching the surface could shift in more complex overlapping patterns. Not one cycle, but two layered together, occasionally aligning and occasionally drifting apart. It seems that in those more complex cases, the very idea of a year might lose some of its familiar shape. Instead of 4 seasons returning predictably in the same order every single time, a planet might experience longer irregular stretches of warmth and cold, sometimes more extreme, sometimes barely noticeable, depending on how the two stars happen to be positioned during that particular stretch of its orbit. There is something quietly disorienting in that thought if you sit with it for a moment. And yet underneath the disorientation there is also something strangely freeing. A world where time does not insist on repeating itself in exactly the same rhythm every single cycle. What we understand so far suggests that this kind of irregularity would not necessarily make such a world unstable. It would simply make it less predictable in the way we are used to predicting things. Researchers studying known binary star systems with planets such as the well-documented case of Kepler 16b, a real planet discovered orbiting two stars together, have found that while these orbits can be mathematically complex, they are often remarkably stable over very long periods. The complexity lives in the details. The overall rhythm still holds. The mind quietly registers stability and predictability as two slightly different things, even though we often treat them as the same. Something can remain steady, safe, unthreatening, without ever repeating itself in identical fashion. A river is stable in that way. It always flows. It is never the same water twice. Perhaps a world with two suns would carry that same quality in its years, always turning, always warming and cooling in some recognizable rhythm, but never folding back into an identical copy of the year before it. It may be that life evolving on such a world would simply develop a different relationship with time itself, one built less around a fixed calendar and more around continuous observation. Instead of memorizing that winter always follows autumn, in the same way every year, such life might learn to read the sky directly, the position of each star, the subtle shifts in colour and warmth, less reliance on memorized pattern, more reliance on present awareness. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider when they first imagine a world with two suns. It has less to do with the sky above and more to do with something happening much closer, inside the body itself. Here on Earth, nearly every living creature carries something called a circadian rhythm, an internal clock roughly 24 hours long that quietly governs sleep, alertness, hunger, and even subtle shifts in body temperature throughout the day. Neuroscientists have observed that this rhythm is deeply tied to light, specifically the steady repeating cycle of one sunrise and one sunset every single day that our bodies have evolved around for an extraordinarily long time. On a planet with two suns, especially if their rising and setting did not align perfectly, that internal rhythm might need to be shaped very differently. Some configurations could still offer a fairly normal day and night cycle, simply with two suns sharing daylight hours together. Others, depending on the orbital relationship between the stars, might create days where one sun sets while the other remains in the sky for hours longer, stretching what we would call daylight into something longer or shorter, or simply less even than what our bodies are used to. Evidence suggests that even small disruptions to a steady light cycle can noticeably affect human sleep mood and energy here on Earth. People living through extended daylight near the poles during summer, or extended darkness during winter, often experience real shifts in how their internal clock behaves. A world with two suns, depending on its particular rhythm, might ask any life living there to develop an internal clock built around something more complex than a simple 24-hour loop. Perhaps two overlapping rhythms instead of one, a longer pattern, woven from both. The brain tends to adapt to whatever rhythm it is given, as long as that rhythm remains consistent enough over time. Studies of human sleep in unusual environments deep within caves away from any natural light at all have found that without strong cues from outside, an internal sense of day and night still tends to emerge, just sometimes drifting to a slightly longer or shorter cycle than 24 hours. The body, it seems, does not need a perfect single sun to find its own rhythm. It simply needs some rhythm to hold on to. That thought carries a particular kind of comfort the longer you sit with it. Even in unfamiliar conditions, even under two suns instead of one, the body's deeper instinct is not confusion. It is adaptation, a quiet, patient search for whatever pattern is available, and a willingness to settle into it once found. Psychologists often note that humans already carry small variations in their natural sleep rhythms. Some people naturally drawn to early mornings, others more alert late into the night. Even here under one consistent sun, our internal clocks are not identical from person to person. A world with two suns might simply stretch that same natural variation a little further. Not broken, just wider in its range. It may be that beings evolving under such a sky would develop their own version of what we call a good night's rest, shaped not by a single sunset, but by whatever combination of light and dimness and overlapping colour told their bodies it was finally time to slow down. There is something gentle in imagining that a quiet kind of rest existing even there, even under such an unfamiliar sky, not identical to ours, just its own version of the same simple need. For now, let this thought settle quietly alongside everything else that has already settled tonight. The idea that rhythm in some form tends to find a way to exist almost anywhere, given enough time and enough patience and enough darkness to finally rest inside of. There is still more to notice about how such a world might hold on to life at all, not just rhythm, but the deeper question of whether anything could truly survive beneath two suns, and where exactly it might choose to do so. For now, let that question stay distant and soft the way most good questions do, right before sleep finally arrives. There is a stillness that tends to arrive around this part of the night, the kind where the body feels heavier than the mind, even though both are slowing down together. If your hands have gone quiet, if your breathing has settled into something slower than before, that is exactly where this can meet you. Let's keep drifting. Before the conversation lingered on rhythm and time on the way, a world circling two suns might lose its familiar calendar and find a new one. Now the thought turns towards something a little more grounded. Not whether such a world could exist, but whether anything could actually live there, and quietly whether something already does. Researchers have found that the search for planets beyond our own solar system, worlds we call exoplanets, has grown enormously over the past few decades. Thousands have now been confirmed orbiting all kinds of stars in all kinds of arrangements. And among them, scientists have identified a small but very real number of planets that orbit two stars at once, exactly the kind of world this whole evening has been quietly imagining. One of the most well-known is Kepler 16b, discovered in the year 2011. It is not a planet we imagine. It is one we have measured, confirmed, watched cross in front of both of its stars from thousands of light years away. Its discovery proved in a very concrete way that a planet truly can find a stable orbit around two suns, rather than just one. Not theory, not fiction. A real documented place simply too far away and too cold for life as we understand it to ever visit. There is something quietly moving in that the idea that what felt like imagination earlier tonight has in some form already been confirmed to exist out there. Not in exactly the way we pictured it, perhaps, but close enough that the picture itself was never really fantasy to begin with. It seems that since Kepler 16b, astronomers have found several other examples of circumbinary planets, worlds orbiting pairs of stars together, each one slightly different. Some orbit closely spaced binary stars, others orbit wider pairs. Some are gas giants, far too large and inhospitable for anything we would recognize as life. But their existence alone tells us something gentle and important. Wherever two stars find a way to settle into a stable orbit together, a planet can sometimes find its own stable place nearby. Studies indicate that the conditions required for such a planet to support life as we understand it are fairly specific, though not impossible. The planet would need to sit within what scientists often call a habitable zone, not too close to either star where heat would be overwhelming, and not too far where warmth would fade into permanent cold. In a binary system, this habitable zone can shift and shrink Depending on how the two stars interact, but it does not disappear. It simply becomes a little more delicate to locate. The mind quietly registers delicate things as worth protecting rather than dismissing. A narrow path is still a path. A smaller window of stability is still stability as long as something manages to settle inside it. What we understand so far suggests that the most promising candidates for life in binary systems tend to be circumbinary planets, the kind orbiting both stars together from a respectful distance rather than planets orbiting only one star closely, while a second star looms much nearer than our own moon ever does. In the wider shared orbits, the combined warmth from both stars can blend into something steadier, more averaged out, more forgiving. Over the long timescales life typically needs to take root and slowly evolve. There is a particular kind of reassurance in that detail. Stability even here tends to favor distance and patience over closeness and intensity. The same kind of quiet wisdom that often applies far closer to home than any distant star. It may be that somewhere among the thousands of star systems already catalogued, a planet exists right now, warmed gently by two suns, sitting calmly within that narrow hospitable range, completely unaware that anyone is even imagining it tonight. We may never know for certain. The distances involved are almost incomprehensibly vast, and confirming life elsewhere, even simple life, remains one of the most difficult challenges in all of science. Evidence suggests that even detecting the basic chemical signatures of life on a distant planet, things like oxygen, methane, or other gases that might hint at biological activity, requires extraordinarily precise instruments, many of which are only now becoming powerful enough to attempt the search seriously. Scientists are still exploring how to refine these methods further, hoping that within the coming decades we may finally be able to examine the atmospheres of distant worlds closely enough to notice these subtle telling signs. Psychologists often note that uncertainty, when it remains gentle rather than threatening, can actually deepen curiosity rather than create anxiety. Not knowing whether such a world exists does not close the question. It simply leaves it open, soft and unresolved, the way certain questions are allowed to stay unresolved for a very long time without losing any of their quiet wonder. There is something almost soothing in that kind of open question, the kind with no deadline attached to it. We are not waiting anxiously for an answer tonight. We are simply allowing the question to exist quietly, somewhere just beyond what we currently know. Neuroscientists have observed that the human mind tends to relax more easily around uncertainty when there is no pressure attached to resolving it immediately. Curiosity in its gentlest form does not demand an answer right away. It simply enjoys holding the question for a while, turning it over slowly the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your hand without needing to do anything more with it than notice its shape. So for tonight, the question of whether life exists somewhere among the binary stars can simply stay exactly that. A question. Open, soft, and patient. Not something to solve before sleep arrives, but something gentle enough to rest alongside. There is still a part of this story that has not been touched yet, something closer to home than any distant exoplanet. The way our own culture has imagined two suns long before any telescope ever confirmed they could truly exist. For now, let the distant world stay distant. Let the question stay open. And let your own breathing continue exactly as slow and steady as it already is. There is a particular kind of drift that happens around now where thoughts stop arriving in full sentences and start arriving more like images instead. If that has already begun for you, you do not need to fight it. You can let it keep happening. Let's keep drifting. Before the attention rested on distant worlds, on the real planets already found circling two suns out among the stars. Now the thought turned somewhere closer, not to other star systems, but to our own sky and to the long, quiet history of people imagining exactly this long before anyone had a telescope capable of confirming it. It seems that nearly every ancient culture that left behind written or spoken stories also left behind some version of a sky with more than one sun. In parts of East Asia, old folklore describes a time when 10 suns once burned in the sky together, scorching the earth below, until most were finally brought down, leaving only the one we know today. In other traditions, multiple suns appear not as a single myth, but as a recurring symbol of overwhelming heat or overwhelming abundance, depending on the storyteller. There is something quietly moving in that pattern. Long before anyone understood binary star systems, before anyone had measured the orbit of a real planet around 2 suns, people were already imagining the same basic shape. 2 or more suns sharing one sky, changing what daily life would feel like beneath them. What we understand so far suggests that this kind of imagery may not be purely coincidental. Psychologists often note that certain symbols, the sun, the moon, darkness, light, tend to surface again and again across unrelated cultures simply because they represent experiences every human being shares, regardless of where or when they lived. Warmth, safety, the fear of too much heat or too little light. A second sun in story after story often becomes a way of expressing something emotional long before it becomes a question about astronomy. The mind quietly registers old stories like this as a kind of inherited memory, even when we have no direct connection to the people who first told them. Perhaps because the underlying feeling awe at the sky, curiosity about what moves above us, has never really changed, even as the explanations behind it have evolved enormously. More recently, in modern storytelling, the image of 2 suns has appeared again and again, often without much explanation needed. A particular desert world with twin suns setting together over the horizon from a film many people have seen, even if they were not particularly drawn to science fiction. The exact reason that image lingers so strongly in collective memory may be simpler than it seems. Evidence suggests that visually striking, slightly unfamiliar variations of ordinary things, a sunset but doubled a horizon, but layered, tend to stay with the human memory longer than entirely alien imagery would. The mind holds on to something it almost recognizes more easily than something it cannot relate to at all. There is something gentle in that detail too. We are not actually drawn to 2 suns because they represent something completely foreign. We are drawn to them because they feel like a soft variation of something deeply familiar already. A sunset we already know the feeling of simply doubled. Researchers have found that storytelling itself across nearly every culture tends to use the sky as one of its earliest and most consistent sources of meaning, long before science existed in any formal sense. Before anyone understood why the sun rose and set, people were already building entire belief systems, calendars, and rituals around its movement. A second sun in that context was never simply decoration. It often represented a different version of order itself, sometimes harmonious, sometimes overwhelming depending on the story being told. It may be that this is part of why imagining a real planet beneath 2 real suns feels so quietly satisfying tonight. It connects something ancient, the old instinct to wonder about the sky, with something modern, the actual confirmed existence of circumbinary planets, real worlds we now know orbit 2 stars at once. The myth and the measurement meeting somewhere in the middle. Neuroscientists have observed that this kind of blending ancient imagery resting comfortably alongside modern scientific understanding tends to ease the mind rather than create any tension between the two. We do not need to choose between wonder and evidence. The oldest stories about multiple suns were never really wrong to wonder. They simply did not yet have the tools to confirm what they were imagining. There is a particular kind of comfort in realizing that curiosity itself has not changed very much across thousands of years, even as our methods of answering it certainly have. Someone lying awake long ago, looking up at a single sun and wondering what it would feel like to have 2 was doing something remarkably similar to what is happening quietly in your own mind right now. Scientists are still exploring exactly how cultural memory and scientific discovery influence each other over time, whether old myths sometimes quietly shape which questions scientists choose to study in the first place. It is entirely possible that long before anyone built an instrument capable of detecting a real exoplanet orbiting two stars, the idea was already living gently in human imagination, waiting patiently for the technology to eventually catch up to the story. That thought carries its own kind of quiet reassurance. Imagination rarely moves entirely separately from discovery. More often it moves just ahead of it, gently, patiently, the way a soft light sometimes appears at the edge of a window, long before the sun itself actually rises. Studies indicate that storytelling and scientific curiosity activate surprisingly similar areas of the brain, both relying heavily on imagination, on the ability to picture something not currently present, and to hold that picture steadily enough to examine it further. Perhaps that is why this entire evening has felt less like a lesson and more like a story slowly unfolding, because in many ways that is exactly what understanding the universe has always required. Not just careful measurement, but a quiet willingness to imagine first. So for now, let the old stories and the new discoveries rest together quietly side by side the way they have always somehow managed to do. The myths were never separate from the science. They were simply its earliest, softest beginning. There is still something tender left to consider tonight, something less about stars or stories, and more about what it might feel like emotionally to actually live beneath a sky that never fully goes dark. For now, let that feeling stay distant and unformed, the way most feelings do right before they are finally ready to be noticed. There is a kind of quiet that no longer needs explaining by this point in the night, the kind where your body has already decided to rest, even if a small soft part of your attention is still gently here listening. Let's keep drifting, before the thought turned toward old stories the way people long ago imagined two suns, long before science confirmed they could truly exist. Now the attention settles somewhere a little more tender, not the sky itself, but what it might feel like quietly in the body to live beneath one that never fully goes dark. Researchers have found that darkness plays a far more active role in human rest than most people realize. It is not simply the absence of light. It is a signal, a fairly direct one, that tells the body it is safe to begin slowing down. When light fades in the evening, a part of the brain called the pineal gland gradually increases its production of melatonin, a hormone closely tied to the onset of sleepiness. Light delays that process. Darkness allows it to happen. It seems that a world circling two suns, especially one where true complete darkness arrived only briefly or irregularly, might ask quite a lot of whatever biology evolved there. Not necessarily a lesser kind of rest, just a very different relationship with the signal that usually tells a body it is time to slow down. There is something quietly poignant in that thought, sitting with it for a moment. The idea of needing rest in a place where the world itself rarely fully cooperates by going dark. What we understand so far suggests that life is remarkably adaptable when it comes to finding rest even without perfect darkness. Some animals here on Earth already manage this in their own way. Certain birds are known to sleep with only half of their brain at a time, one hemisphere resting, while the other stays faintly alert, a state researchers call unihemispheric sleep. It allows them to rest even while flying or while remaining partially watchful for danger. The body, it seems, does not require ideal conditions to find some form of recovery. It simply finds whatever version of rest the conditions will allow. The mind quietly registers this kind of adaptability as something deeply reassuring, almost moving when you really sit with it. Rest is not fragile. It does not disappear the moment conditions become slightly imperfect. It simply reshapes itself, finds another doorway in when the first one happens to be closed. Perhaps beings evolving beneath two suns would develop their own version of this. Not full darkness required, but some internal signal instead, colour dimness. The particular angle of light low on the horizon learned over countless generations to mean the same thing. Darkness means to us now safety, permission, the quiet cue that it is finally acceptable to let go. Evidence suggests that humans, even here on Earth, are far more adaptable in this regard than we usually give ourselves credit for. People living through long Arctic summers where the sun barely sets at all for weeks at a time still manage to sleep, often adjusting fairly well after an initial period of difficulty. The body recalibrates, it finds new cues, it learns to read available light differently than it did before. Psychologists often note that this kind of adaptation is not purely physical either. It carries an emotional dimension as well. Comfort, it turns out, is not something we discover once and keep forever in exactly the same form. It is something we keep quietly redefining depending on whatever circumstances life happens to place us in. There is a particular kind of tenderness in that idea. The thought that rest is not one fixed thing, waiting to be found, but something living, something that adjusts itself gently to fit wherever you actually are. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, underneath every layer explored so far tonight. Not the gravity of two suns, not their light, not their tides, but something quieter than all of that. The simple, steady capacity to find safety even inside conditions that are unfamiliar, even shifting, even strange. Neuroscientists have observed that the brain's deepest relaxation responses are not actually triggered by perfect ideal conditions most of the time. They are triggered by familiarity, by repetition, by small recognizable cues that something is safe regardless of how unusual the surrounding circumstances might otherwise be. A second sun in the sky, however strange it might first seem, would likely become in time simply one more familiar part of an ordinary evening. Not threatening, just different. And difference given enough time tends to soften into the ordinary. Studies indicate that even small repeated rituals, the simple act of lying down at a certain time, dimming, a light settling beneath the same blanket each night can become powerful cues for the body to begin relaxing, almost independent of the actual light or darkness present in the room. The mind in many ways can be gently trained to feel safe through pattern and repetition, rather than relying purely on external darkness to deliver that feeling for it. That is part of what this very moment is quietly doing for you right now. Not the absence of all light or sound necessarily, but the steady repeated rhythm of a voice moving slowly, predictably without urgency, signalling gently to your own nervous system that nothing requires alertness right now. Nothing requires solving. Nothing requires holding on to. Scientists are still exploring exactly how much of human relaxation depends on external conditions versus internal expectation. But what we understand so far suggests that expectation carries enormous weight. If a mind believes, even quietly, even without fully realizing it, that it is safe to rest, now that belief alone begins to lower heart rate, slow breathing, and ease tension throughout the body, often before any external condition has changed at all. There is something deeply comforting in that. Real rest does not depend entirely on the world cooperating perfectly. It depends in large part on a quiet internal permission, a felt sense that nothing else needs to happen right now except this. Lying still, breathing slowly, letting whatever is unresolved simply remain unresolved until tomorrow without that being any kind of problem at all. Perhaps that is the quiet underlying gift hidden inside this entire imagined world beneath two suns. Not really a lesson about astronomy, but a soft reminder about rest itself. Rest is not something that only happens under perfect simple conditions. One sun, one steady darkness, one predictable night. It is something far more resilient than that. Something capable of finding its way into nearly any condition as long as the body is finally given permission to stop bracing and simply soften instead. So wherever you are right now, however dark or not entirely dark the room around you happens to be, you do not need ideal conditions to rest well tonight. You only need permission, and that permission can simply be given now quietly the way it is being offered to you in this very moment. There is still a little more to drift through together before this particular evening fully settles into stillness, a few last soft places left to imagine before everything finally grows quiet. For now, let this permission stay exactly as it is. Simple, quiet, already enough. There is a particular hush that settles in around this point, the kind where even small sounds of breath, the soft shift of a blanket start to feel very far away. If you are somewhere close to that now, you can simply let it continue. Let's keep drifting. Before the thought rested gently on rest itself, on the quiet permission the body gives itself to slow down even under unfamiliar skies. Now the attention turns towards something a little wider, not the body's rhythm, but the careful narrow space within a binary system where life might actually find room to exist at all. Researchers have found that not every region around two suns offers the same kind of welcome. Closer in near-either star conditions tend to be far too intense, scorching heat radiation, gravitational pulling strong enough to make any stable orbit difficult to maintain. Farther out, warmth fades quickly into a cold deep enough to freeze almost anything familiar to us. Somewhere between those two extremes, though, there is often a narrow air and a kind of quiet middle ground where temperatures could allow liquid water to exist. Scientists generally call this the habitable zone. It seems that in a binary system, this habitable zone behaves a little differently than it would around a single star. Sometimes the gravitational influence of two stars can stretch that zone, or shift it slightly, or even in certain unstable configurations disrupt it altogether. But studies indicate that in many well-balanced systems, particularly the wider circumbinary kind already discussed, a planet can still settle into something quite close to the kind of steady moderate warmth that life as we understand it would need. There is something quietly reassuring in that detail. Even with two suns instead of one, balance remains possible. It simply requires the right distance, the right orbit, the right patience for gravity to settle into something workable. What we understand so far suggests that scientists evaluate these zones using fairly careful modelling, accounting for the combined brightness of both stars, their distance from each other, and the planet's own orbital path around them. It is in some ways a more complex calculation than a single star system requires, but not an impossible one. The mathematics simply has more variables to hold at once, the way a more elaborate recipe still produces something nourishing, as long as every ingredient is measured with enough care. The mind quietly registers complexity when it resolves into something workable, as far less intimidating than complexity that never settles at all. A habitable zone shaped by two suns is not chaos. It is simply a slightly more intricate kind of order, one with more moving parts, but still ultimately an order. Evidence suggests that even within our own solar system, the conditions necessary for life are narrower than people often assume. Earth itself sits within a fairly precise range of distance from our single sun, close enough for liquid water, far enough to avoid being overwhelmed by heat. Venus, slightly closer to the sun than Earth, became a world of crushing, scorching atmosphere. Mars, slightly farther, became cold and thin, its water mostly locked away in ice. A single sun already demands a fairly careful balance. Two suns simply ask for that same careful balance to be found amid a slightly more layered set of conditions. It may be that this is part of why circumbinary planets, the ones settled in that wider shared orbit around both stars, tend to interest scientists most when searching for potentially habitable worlds. Their distance from both stars combined offers a kind of averaging effect, smoothing out some of the more extreme fluctuations that might occur closer in, not eliminating complexity entirely, just softening its sharper edges. Psychologists often note that humans tend to feel calmer in environments that offer this same kind of averaging conditions that remain within a moderate tolerable range, rather than swinging unpredictably between extremes. Perhaps that is part of why this particular configuration, two suns, one planet settled patiently in a wide, careful orbit around both, feels so soothing to imagine. It mirrors something the body already prefers. Steadiness found amid complexity rather than steadiness only found in simplicity. There is a tenderness in that parallel if you sit with it for a moment. We're not so different from the kind of world we've been imagining all evening. Both in our own way are simply searching for a stable range to exist within, somewhere between too much and too little, where something gentle and lasting can finally take root. Scientists are still exploring just how many circumbinary planets might actually sit within a truly habitable range since detecting them, and confirming the precise conditions on their surface remains extraordinarily difficult from such enormous distances. But the fact that the right configurations are mathematically possible, and that several real circumbinary planets have already been discovered, however inhospitable most of them currently appear, keeps that narrow, hopeful possibility quietly open. Neuroscientists have observed that the brain tends to find a particular kind of comfort in possibilities that remain open rather than fully resolved, especially late at night when the mind is less interested in firm conclusions and more drawn towards soft, ongoing wonder. The thought that somewhere among the binary stars there could exist a planet quietly holding water, holding warmth, holding perhaps even the earliest beginnings of something living, does not need to be confirmed tonight in order to feel meaningful. It only needs to remain gently, genuinely possible. It seems fitting somehow that a story which began with one ordinary question, what if Earth had two suns, has slowly widened into something larger. Not just a thought experiment about light and shadow, but a quiet reminder that balance, the kind necessary for any life at all, seems to be something the universe is willing to offer in more than one form. Around one star. Around two. In places we have measured and in places we have only imagined so far. There is something almost gentle in ending this particular thread there without needing to resolve it any further tonight. Somewhere perhaps a careful narrow band of warmth exists between two patient suns, quietly holding whatever it is meant to hold, whether we ever discover it or not. For now, there are only a few soft places left to drift through together before this evening settles completely into rest. Nothing more to learn urgently, only a little more to simply notice slowly before everything finally grows still. There is a softness in the body now that doesn't need describing anymore. You already know the feeling somewhere underneath the listening. Heavy eyelids, slower breath. A mind that has stopped trying to hold on to every word and started simply floating alongside them instead. Let's keep drifting. Before the thought rested on the narrow, careful band where warmth and water might quietly coexist between two patient suns. Now the attention turns towards something even quieter. Not whether such a world could hold life, but what it might simply feel like to lie beneath its sky at night, the way you are lying beneath your own sky right now. It seems that night on a planet with two suns would rarely look the same twice. Researchers have found that the appearance of the sky from such a world would depend enormously on where the two stars happen to sit in their long orbit around each other at any given time. Some nights might closely resemble our own, both stars below the horizon. Together a sky full of distant stars and only the faint second-hand glow of moons, if any moons exist there at all. Other nights might never fully arrive that way, one star setting while the other remains low and visible for hours longer, casting a soft, persistent light across the horizon, long after what we would normally call sunset. There is something almost dreamlike in that uncertainty, the idea of a sky that genuinely changes its character from one stretch of time to the next rather than repeating the same simple pattern every single evening. What we understand so far suggests that on the rare nights when both stars did fully set together, the resulting darkness might feel especially deep by comparison, almost a relief after longer stretches of lingering twilight. Evidence suggests that contrast itself plays a powerful role in how we experience comfort. A truly dark, quiet night probably would not feel ordinary on such a world. It would feel rare, special, something noticed and perhaps even quietly anticipated, the way certain comforts here on Earth feel sweeter simply because they do not arrive constantly. The mind quietly registers scarcity in gentle forms as something that deepens appreciation rather than discomfort. A full, dark, silent night on a world where such nights were occasional rather than guaranteed might be treasured in a way our own nightly darkness rarely is, simply because we have always had it so reliably. Perhaps on such a world the arrival of full darkness would carry its own quiet ritual, a specific stillness recognized and welcomed rather than simply expected. The kind of attention we sometimes give to a clear night sky, here pausing to actually look up rather than letting darkness pass by unnoticed the way it usually does. Scientists are still exploring how the night sky itself, the visible stars beyond the two suns, would appear from inside a binary system. From most reasonable distances, the rest of the universe would likely look fairly similar to how it looks from Earth. Scattered points of light, distant galaxies too faint to see directly, the familiar quiet backdrop behind any closer source of light. The two suns themselves would dominate the foreground, but everything farther away would likely remain much the same. An old, steady backdrop unaffected by the particular arrangement of any single star system in front of it. There is something comforting in that detail when you let it settle. Even somewhere as unusual as a planet beneath two suns, the deep background of the universe, the ancient light from galaxies far beyond, would likely look remarkably familiar. The strangeness belongs only to the foreground, while the deeper stillness behind it remains in some sense shared, the same far away. Psychologists often note that humans tend to find unexpected reassurance in shared backdrops, even imagined ones. The thought that someone or something somewhere else entirely might look up into roughly the same field of distant stars that we do, simply with a different, closer light glowing nearby, creates a quiet sense of connection rather than distance. Not identical experiences, but not entirely separate ones either. It may be that lying beneath such a sky, whatever form of life existed there, the deepest, most basic feeling would not be so different from the one settling into your own body right now. The simple, quiet relief of looking upward into something vast and feeling small in a gentle way rather than a frightening one. The sense that whatever concerns occupied the day simply matter less for a while against something that large, and that old, and that endlessly patient. Neuroscientists have observed that looking at a night sky even briefly tends to activate a sense of what researchers sometimes call awe, a particular emotional state associated with reduced stress and a softer, more expansive sense of time. It does not require understanding astrophysics to feel this. It only requires looking up and allowing the scale of what is visible to register even briefly somewhere quiet beneath ordinary thought. Perhaps that is part of why this entire evening has unfolded the way it has, not as a lesson about a hypothetical planet, but as a long, slow invitation to feel that same expansive smallness borrowed gently from a sky that may or may not exist exactly the way it has been imagined tonight. There is a particular kind of stillness available in that thought, whether or not a planet circling two suns ever proves to hold life. The simple act of imagining it carefully enough has already done something quiet and real. It has slowed your breathing, it has softened your attention, It has for a little while replaced the smaller concerns of an ordinary day with something larger, gentler, and far less urgent to resolve. Studies indicate that this kind of slow, expansive imagining, sometimes called cognitive defocusing, plays a measurable role in helping the mind disengage from narrower, more anxious patterns of thought. Picturing something vast and distant without needing to solve anything about it appears to ease the nervous system in much the same way deep, slow breathing does. The mind rests not because it has found an answer, but because it has simply been given permission to stop searching for one, at least for tonight. So perhaps the planet beneath two suns was never really the point, not entirely. Perhaps it was simply a soft, patient doorway leading you gently back toward your own stillness, your own breath, your own night, the one actually surrounding you right now. There is only a little more left to settle into together, before this particular evening finally allows itself to rest completely. For now, let the sky stay exactly as wide and quiet as it already feels. Let the stars, real or imagined, simply continue to exist somewhere above you, unhurried, unchanging, patient enough to still be there whenever you happen to look up again. There is nothing left to figure out now, nothing left to follow closely. The mind can simply let go of trying for these last few minutes and let the rest of this settle on its own. Let's keep drifting. All evening, the thought travelled somewhere far away. Two suns, a slow, careful orbit, a sky that rarely went fully dark. It was a gentle place to visit for a while, layered with light and tides and quiet questions that never needed solving. Researchers have found that the human body, even after long stretches of imagining something unfamiliar, tends to return easily to whatever rhythm it already knows best. The mind can wander for hours through distant stars and unfamiliar skies, and still the body underneath continues quietly preparing for sleep, exactly the way it always has. Imagination does not interrupt that process. If anything, it tends to support it, occupying the mind gently enough that the body can keep doing its own slow work underneath almost unnoticed. It seems fitting somehow that the story now begins to fold itself back towards something simpler. Not two suns anymore, just one. The one that set hours ago somewhere beyond the walls of this room and will not return again for a while yet. This is the sky your body has always known. One soft source of warmth, one steady rhythm, one darkness complete and familiar settling in around you exactly the way it has every night before this one. There is no need to compare it to anything imagined. No need to hold on to the planet beneath two suns or its long twilight or its layered tides. That world can simply stay where it was quiet and distant, turning slowly somewhere far beyond this room, needing nothing further from you tonight. Here there is only this. One light already gone, one night already arrived, one body already heavier than it was an hour ago. The breathing has slowed. You may have noticed that already, or you may not have noticed at all, which is its own kind of proof that it has happened. There is nothing more to learn right now, nothing more to listen for, only the simple ordinary dark, the same dark that has always meant the same quiet thing. Rest, just rest. Somewhere out past this room, two suns may still be turning slowly around each other, patient, unhurried, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. They do not need you to keep thinking about them. They will still be there in their own slow rhythm, whether your mind holds on to the thought or lets it go completely. You can let it go now. There is only this room, this blanket, this single familiar dark. Your shoulders can soften a little more. Your hands can stop holding anything at all. The night outside is quiet. The night inside you is quieter still. Nothing needs to be remembered from this evening. Nothing needs to be carried forward into tomorrow. Whatever settled gently into your mind tonight can simply stay here soft and unfinished, the way most good thoughts are allowed to stay. The room is dark. The breath is slow. Somewhere far away a light is fading the way it always eventually does. And here, much closer, another light is fading too, just a little dimmer now. Just a little further from waking. Tick go. Let everything go. Just the quiet now. Just the dark. Just sleep, arriving slowly the way it always does, asking nothing more of you than this.